Pizza.
I'm Leah Marcus. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Program of Jewish Studies. This is the second in our series on translation/transmission. And the translation in this case is translatio imperii, with a Latin phrase for the transfer of rule, usually implied to be the orderly transfer of rule from one generation to the next, but also potentially a translation that involves loss, gain, transformation. So we'll see what Professor Avishai's talk has to do with those matters. He will be introduced by Professor Thomas Schwartz, who is teaching a wonderful course for Jewish Studies this year, as he did last year, on power and diplomacy in the Middle East. So thank you all very much for coming, and we hope you enjoy the show.
It's my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Bernard Avishai has enjoyed a fascinating and varied career. He earned a doctorate in political economy from the University of Toronto, taught at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. As I learned today, he's an extraordinarily gifted teacher, conveying to my students the essentials of the debates within the Zionist movement, the current political situation in Israel, the wonders of the Hebrew language, and what a Middle East peace settlement would look like. Stuff that it takes me an entire semester to teach. A Guggenheim Fellow, Dr. Avishai went on to be contributing editor to the Harvard Business Review, and as he told my class, gaining a perspective on the computer and information revolution from its birth in the mid-'80s through the astounding changes of the last 20 years. He's also had a career as a journalist, originally writing for the New York Review of Books, and then later pieces for the New Yorker, Harvard Business Review, and is a contributing editor at Harper's, among many other publications. He's the author of 3 books on Israel, including the widely read and praised Tragedy of Zionism. He is here tonight to discuss his most recently published book, which is up here, The Hebrew Republic. This book has been praised by the New York Times as a brilliantly argued text, and they referred to Dr. Avishai as a Herzl for the modern age. Now, he told me before not to refer to him as a leading Israeli public intellectual, but he is a leading public intellectual, I think, in a world where those borders and boundaries are really not very important. And so please join me in welcoming to Vanderbilt Dr. Bernard Avishai.
Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming out. I think it's mandatory to make some joke about how you're giving up the first night of the World Series and so on, but I'm a Red Sox fan, and I know that most of you are sort of displaced from northeastern cities, and do you really give a rip about the Tampa Rays? I mean, so there's no real point consoling you about the World Series tonight. I'm going to make an argument, and then I'm going to throw it open for questions. I know that there are plenty of people in this room who've been following the issues in the Middle East for many years, especially people with gray hair, like myself. As I was telling the class today, I always thought that when I first started writing about this back in the early 70s, my first article was right after the 73 war in the New York Review. I thought those issues were so compelling. I haven't really heard an original argument since. I always thought the Middle East conflict would just end when people were bored to death. I'm going to try to raise some new issues tonight, but I'm not going to pretend that the questions that most of us have are terribly original. I will hope to leave time for a good deal of questions. We have till, it's 8 o'clock now, right? I'm on Eastern time, so it's actually 9:15, but we're going until 8 to 9:30, 10, something like that. So I'm assuming that there'll be plenty of time for questions. let's see if I can explain to you the origins of this book and help you understand what moved me to write it. As I said, I've been writing about Israel and the Middle East conflict, and then when I went to the Harvard Business Review, I started writing about Israel's high-tech economy. I started to explore these issues a long time ago and went back in 2002 to Jerusalem as someone who had lived in Jerusalem in the 1970s for 5 years, had been back as a journalist 20 times, was now moving back with my then new wife, and was committing to living in Jerusalem again, teaching in Israel again, and would sort of sit around the table with a lot of my old friends, people who had founded the Peace Now group, people from the free professions. I was actually directing a program at a new college called the Interdisciplinary Center, Merkaz Ben Tchumi, for those of you who know it. And this was a program in entrepreneurship. So I had a lot of kind of old-timers, professionals, lawyers, entrepreneurs, academics, scientists, doctors, people at my dinner table, a lot. And I began to notice, actually my wife began to notice, that no one used the term peace process anymore. No one would talk about diplomatic initiatives. No one would look at the details of the peace process anymore. And I, as a journalist, whose last year living in Israel was the year of the first Camp David agreement in 1979, was a little kind of mystified. Because in 1979, we used to do nothing but think about, if Sadat does X, will Dayan do Y? If Carter does Y, will, Assad do Z, and so on. We spent a lot of time agonizing, torturing ourselves over the likelihood of this or that diplomatic move, and this continued through to the 1990s and the Oslo peace process. Stop me if you don't know what I'm talking about. The Oslo peace, I'm going to throw some things out here that I'm assuming most people who bothered to come out on the first night of the World Series probably know. Okay? You know what I mean when I talk about the Oslo peace process. The 1990s process that was kicked off in 1993 with the signing of the first Oslo agreement. It's Arafat, Rabin, White House lawn. Will he shake his hand? Won't he shake his hand? Remember the Oslo peace process? Okay. No one was talking about this anymore. People were talking about something called hamatzav, the situation. Hamatzav. And they spoke about the situation a little like the way alcoholics speak about being alcoholic. It's like, it's a condition that you manage, but you never expect ever for the rest of your existence to cure. Or like, a cancer in remission or something. We have a condition. It's like a Jewish joke, actually, about a Jewish mother who has a condition. The Jewish state had a condition. And the condition was, well, nobody could exactly pinpoint what it was. It was just the thing you lived with. And the thing you lived with was tension and what seemed to be a kind of impossible stress that issued from a conflict that could not have a resolution. Now, the sense of mystification I had was intensified by a number of things. First of all, I moved to Jerusalem in 2002, and in my general vicinity, if you kind of draw an arc around my home, an arc of about a mile, there were something like 4 successful bombings of restaurants. A 5th which was foiled, and something like 6 bus bombings within a mile of my home. And people were living in the middle of this tremendous crisis, which, you could say, well, yes, but, of course we can't make peace with them. But everybody knew that the people you were trying to make peace with were the alternative to them. So you couldn't look at the bombings that came from Hamas and Islamic Jihad and so on and say, well, because of them, there's no point talking about a peace plan with the Palestine Authority. Even though Arafat was certainly not anyone's favorite Palestinian leader, Arafat had met certain benchmarks, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. But I'll take it another step. After Arafat died, he was replaced by someone who had actually negotiated back in 1995 the so-called Abu Mazen-Yossi Beilin agreement, so that we already knew that the person that was replacing Arafat was much more amenable to some kind of peace process, some kind of peace plan. And yet the word matzav didn't change. We continued to have virtually no sense that the difficulties we were facing, the bombings and so on, could have anything like a political resolution. I mean, imagine in Northern Ireland if people said, well, we can't talk peace, they're bombing. You do, in fact, have to continue to reach out. You have to have negotiations. You have to do that when they're bombing. That's how you eventually get to something like a ceasefire. But leave that aside for the moment. It actually begs a larger question and a bigger mystery. The Oslo process was supposed to produce a period of confidence building to be succeeded by a final status agreement. What the Oslo process actually produced was a final status agreement with absolutely no confidence that it could be implemented. That's the irony. By 2000, the end of 2000, December 2000, you already had negotiations in Taba, which had resolved most of the issues which had been plaguing the negotiation in the Camp David, this other Camp David conference between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat that had failed the summer before. And what were the terms of those agreements? You would have the 67 borders in effect, but since there are so many Israeli Jewish settlers on the other side of the Green Line, particularly around Hebron and the Gush Etzion bloc, there would be a ceding of a certain amount of land from the Palestinian state to the Jewish state, and the Palestinians would be compensated with other land more or less on a one-for-one basis. So the essential agreement over land had been reached. This was a no-brainer. No one really thought this would be a problem, and it wasn't. It's true that in retrospect, people looked at the Camp David agreement and the maps that Barak had given Arafat and the way Arafat had recoiled from the maps and so on and so on. But this was not going to be a particular problem. On Jerusalem, it was understood that Arab Jerusalem would be part of a Palestinian state, Jewish Jerusalem would be part of the Israeli state, and in the Temple Mount, which is in effect a museum, I mean, no one is going to have zoning regulations to see where near the Temple Mount Marriott will build its health spas. I mean, that's not the kind of issue you had. You basically needed curators of the museum. The old city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount would be resolved through some kind of creative stipulation of a border, which meant that the Western Wall was in the Jewish zone, the noble sanctuary, the old Temple Mount, would be in the Arab zone, but the areas underneath the Temple Mount where the ancient Jewish caves were would in effect be under Israeli sovereignty. And finally, on the question of refugees, which was supposed to be the intractable question of Palestinian refugees who are supposed to have a right of return, and the Israelis say, no, 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 you can't have the right of return because the right of return would mean a repudiation of Israel and the Jewish state and a kind of overrunning of the Jewish state. Well, in fact, that was already negotiated. It was negotiated along the following lines, that the Palestinians would have a right of return. That right would be expressed according to a certain number of modalities through financial compensation, and I've heard figures in the tens of billions of dollars that were being thrown around to compensate Arabs for losing their homes in the 1940s, through repatriation to the Palestinian state, which would be the state created in Palestine. Maybe I ought to, as long as I have a board here, I ought to just kind of have a kind of makeshift map, right? So this is Mediterranean, this is Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea, right? I don't know if these are exactly right, but you'll give me a little rounding error here. So here is Jerusalem, here is Tel Aviv, more or less. And the West Bank comes sort of like that, except Jerusalem is like here, okay? Tel Aviv is like that, okay? Okay? So the West Bank, I mean, I can make it a little better, I guess. Huh? Sort of like that, okay? No, that's wrong. Yeah, really. Sort of more like that. Okay, Jordan, this is Jordan, right? This is the West Bank. Let's say Gaza. It's down here, okay? And there was supposed to, when I talk about compensation for land, part of the land that would be compensated is a passageway between Gaza and the West Bank, okay? So it was understood that Palestinian refugees would come back into the West Bank. There was no room in Gaza. It was never entertained that they'd come back to Gaza, right? But in the meantime, the Jewish settlements around here would be part of Israel, and maybe Gaza would get that. Okay? So, in effect, you already had a peace deal. Everybody knew what the peace deal was. When there was a certain amount of questions about how you'd finalize the negotiations, this was actually thrown to Bill Clinton. And by the 20th of January, it was actually the 19th of January, it was promulgated 19th January 2001, the day before he left office, you had the Clinton bridging proposals, what's called the Clinton parameters, and the Clinton parameters were understood to be the compromise proposals that were more or less acceptable to both sides. Now, the Palestinians said, yes, I accept the Clinton bridging parameters. I have these 23 questions, these 23 reservations. Ehud Barak, for his part, said, I have, in fact, he went on television. I saw him on television. I wasn't living in Israel yet, but I was visiting Israel at that time. He went on television, and he was basically defending on Israeli television the redivision of Jerusalem. But he also knew that he was going to be facing a new election, that because of the bombings, Ariel Sharon looked like he very well might be elected prime minister. So the Clinton bridging parameters were kind of, eventually put aside. But that shouldn't have changed my dinner table conversations, right? Most of the people I was talking to were professionals, educated people, peaceniks, not necessarily peaceniks, centrists, people who had some very strong understanding of Israel's place in the world and should certainly have an interest in a peace settlement. So you had a deal and people weren't actually willing to talk about the plausibility of its implementation. Moreover, something that made it even more strange, most of the people I was talking to, entrepreneurs, lawyers, doctors, academics, scientists, the elite of the country, writers, these people understood that Israel had a fundamental commitment to and benefit from globalization. These are people who understood that Israel had done something that very few other developing countries had managed to do, which is make a real success of themselves in the global economy. Israel had something like 3,000 startups from 1990 to 2001, 2002. 3,000 startups. 200 Israeli companies on foreign stock exchanges, on the NASDAQ, on the London Stock Exchange. More than any other country except for Canada. Not per capita, more than any other country except for Canada. Israel was often called Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley. It was Silicon Valley East. It was a place where the per capita income had risen to something like number 14 on the list of OECD countries. It was a country which was, over a period of 20 years, watching its gross domestic product quadruple. And a country whose professionals understood very well that you can't have an economy like Singapore and a nationalities war like Serbia. So the people around my table should have understood that peace was going to be of fundamental importance to the maintenance of a process of economic growth which would be necessary at very high rates of growth in order to mitigate tremendous inequalities. A third of the country is under the poverty line, which would have to maintain a tremendous number of people who were more or less wards of the state, Orthodox communities which were being paid to study in the yeshivot. We'll talk more about this in a moment. But there was a kind of mechanism to the Israeli economy that depended on a tremendous amount of economic growth. Israel had enjoyed tremendous economic growth as Rabin took the country into the processes of globalization. Those processes had blown back into the Israeli intelligentsia and created a kind of an Israeli center, which was very much aware of the dependence of the country on these processes of globalization. There were certain people, certain outlying intellectuals and political figures like Benjamin Netanyahu who said, it doesn't matter, we're a high-tech economy, we can actually have growth even if we have war, which is nonsense, and I'll explain why in the question period. I'm not going to get bogged down in this now. But most people understood that globalization would be enabled by a condition of peace, and that you needed to have very strong, continuing growth through globalization in order to mitigate the social tensions that would ensue if the country didn't keep growing at that pace. Okay, so far so good. Okay. How is it possible that you have bombs from radical groups on the Palestinian side? You have a Palestinian Authority led by people who are obviously the alternative to those bombers, and that in the absence of peace, they themselves would likely fall victim to the bombers, which is sort of what happened in Gaza 2 years later. You have a peace deal on the table, which has already been negotiated. And this is going to be the deal, by the way. I just a little aside, a little footnote. every Israeli leader who is about to leave office endorses the deal, right? Ehud Olmert, now everything is supposedly in secret. We don't really know, but of course we know what the deal is. The deal is the deal that Clinton proposed. And now that Olmert is leaving office, he's telling his reporter friends and so on that, oh, by the way, we're going to have one-for-one land swaps, and we're going to have Jerusalem, and yes, Israelis are going to have to get used to the fact that a tremendous number of refugees are going to come back to the greater Jerusalem area, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That everybody knows what the deal is. This is not rocket science. Any reporter who writes an article about the Middle East and talks about, how much more we have to do more work in order to get a deal by October is blowing smoke in your eyes. Because we know what the deal is. The question is not, can we envision it? The question is always, can we put something together from the Israeli side? Can we put something together which will mitigate something else? And I'll get to that something else in a minute. And by the way, it's a deal which has been endorsed. So then other people would come and say, yeah, but what about Iran? What about the region? Right? Can you do a deal when you have something like the Iranian threat, the Iranians posing an existential threat? Well, nothing is more important. Let's say the Iranians are posing an existential threat. What could be more important to Israel if Iran is posing an existential threat? What could be more important to Israel but to make peace with the Palestinians and diffuse whatever poisonous currents get released by the Iranian Revolution and the existential threat? I'm not even trying to endorse. I don't even want to talk now about whether or not Iran really does pose an existential threat. But in 2002, the Saudi government proposes a regional deal, which in effect says if the Palestinians and the Israelis cut a deal, the entire Arab region will simultaneously recognize Israel and endorse the deal. And in 2007, I spent a month teaching in Libya, of all places. There were people in Libya who were telling me, why can't we get on with it already? Why can't we do the deal? This is ridiculous. What is this war over? The Libyan middle class that's trying to rise and sort of throw off their Fidel. They have this sort of crackpot leader for the last, since 1969, I guess it was, when Gaddafi came to power. They are hungry to see an end to the Middle East conflict. So the regional powers, the Arab League and the regional powers, have said, in effect, we will endorse the deal. So if you're trying to diffuse the existential threat of Iran, what could diffuse it better than cutting a deal with all the Arab states of the Arab League? Right? I don't know. Am I missing something? Am I missing something? So the question for my friends was obviously otherwise. What is the problem? The penny dropped for me when I went to visit a friend of mine on Kfar Yoshua. I had been a volunteer in the 1967 war. I was 18 years old. I was certain that Israel was facing a new, genuine existential threat, which it was in the spring of '67. I went as a so-called volunteer. I kind of laugh at myself because, I volunteered, but the war was over before I went, so I actually went for the celebration. And I picked oranges for, 2 months. But the best thing that happened to me in 1967 is I made friends with this wonderful moshavnik, this guy who lives on a cooperative farm called Kfar Yoshua, which is right in the heart of the Valley of Jezreel, which is up here, the sort of heartland of the Zionist revolution, right up here. And I went to see him. And I said, Hanan, help me understand, what am I missing here? Why are we not talking about a deal? I mean, now in retrospect, I'm doing it much more formulaically. I was much more, I was actually much more confused and perplexed and inarticulate then. And he said something to me that really kind of astonished me. But it was also very interesting what he said. He said, Bernie, you don't understand. They don't want us here. And I said, what are you talking about? The Palestinians. I mean, I started, challenging him on they, want, and here. Like, I started challenging all these words, and in fact, all of those words were not really thought through. But I said, what are you talking about, they don't want us here? What do you mean they don't want us here? The Palestinian Authority has already, in effect, endorsed the two-state solution offered by the Clinton bridging parameters. What do you mean they don't want us here? No, he said, not them. Not them, not the Palestinians there. The Arabs of Israel, the minority living in Israel, don't want us here. The Arabs don't want a Jewish state here. And his problem, it turns out, was not the Palestinians, but the Arab minority living in Israel. And then I started challenging that. I said, Hanan, what are you talking about? These are people who you do business with. I've had lunch at your table many times with contractors and friends, people, Arabs who you do business with from down in the other part of the Valley of Jezreel. He said, look, he said, they don't want a Jewish state. Sure, they're prepared to come and do business, but they don't want a Jewish state here. So I'll come back in a moment to what he meant by that. But first I want to help you understand why this kind of thinking precludes doing a deal with the Palestinians. Imagine somebody came to you today, as many people are now kind of whispering about it, that you could do a deal with the Syrians. Imagine Israel could do a deal on the Golan Heights. Would you be in favor of it? Imagine, put yourself in the shoes of an Israeli. Would you give up the Golan Heights here, give up the Golan Heights, actually the Sea of Galilee is here, right? So, would you give up the Golan Heights here and do a deal with the Syrians before you've made peace with the Palestinians? It's an interesting question. There are certain interesting opportunities. Maybe there are arguments for, arguments against, but one argument that's very, very hard to resist is the argument against that says, no, why would we do a deal with the Syrians, give back the Golan Heights? We haven't solved the problem with the Palestinians. As soon as we go back to war with the Palestinians, any peace we make with the Syrians is going to fall apart, and we've already given up the land. So why would we do that kind of deal? Unless you've solved the essential problem, if you haven't solved the basic problem, why would you do a deal here if you haven't solved this? Because we saw what happened with the Egyptians. Israel withdrew from the Sinai. There's never really been a peace deal with the Egyptians. There's no real trade. There's no real peace. There's a kind of no war, non-aggression pact situation with a little tourism here and there when it's not interrupted by terror. That's the peace with the Egyptians. The right to change planes for South Africa in Cairo if you want to fly cheap. That's what the peace with Egypt really amounts to. So why would you do that? Why would you give up that if you haven't solved this? Well, what Hanan was saying to me, in effect, was, why would you do a deal here if you haven't solved the problem of Arabs who live in Israel? Now, just for your own, edification, how many Arabs live in Israel? Do you know? What part of the population is Arab in Israel?
1 million?
About 1 million, 1.2 million. It's something like a fifth of the country, 20%. 1/4 of the first graders in Israeli schools, public schools, are Arab. 1/4 of the first graders in Israeli public schools are Arab. Another quarter are ultra-Orthodox. Come back to that. Okay? So if you're not going to feel that you can, in effect, make peace with 1/4 of your own population, or let's say 1/5 of your own population, and that's going to unravel, then why would you do a deal with the Palestinians? You're basically in, so Hanan was implying, you're basically in a fight to the finish. Why won't they do a deal? Why won't they want you here, Hanan? And his answer is, you don't understand. They don't want us here. We came, I remember when we took their land. He's 75 years old now. I remember when we took their land and we, built up the areas around Kfar Yoshua after the 48 war, and we destroyed this town, we destroyed that town in order to create space for refugees, and so on and so on and so on. He's still living somewhere in the past. We had to create a Jewish majority here. We had to live and create the reality of a majority Jewish population, and they'll never forgive us for that. I know what it's like to be on the land, he says. I know what it's like to be on the land. And if somebody did that to me, I would never forgive him. There's a kind of interesting projection going on here. And for a certain generation, by the way, there's a kind of truth to it. There's a kind of reality. If this was nothing but a war between two agricultural peoples, the kind of thing that Hanan was saying would have a certain plausibility. In fact, Hanan's 4 children, one works for Texas Instruments, one is building clean rooms for Teva Pharmaceuticals, and 2 are architects, okay, who are living very much in a kind of global world that Hanan does not live in. So don't get all kind of misty-eyed and idealize Hanan. I love Hanan, but as far as his views of the world are concerned, he's kind of an anachronism. He doesn't, and his own kids are proof of his own anachronism. He doesn't speak for the whole reality, but he is expressing something very interesting. They don't want us here. What does that mean, they don't want us here? They, meaning Israeli Arabs, don't want a Jewish state here. And if we have a Jewish state, we are only creating for them an ongoing incitement which will eventually create violence that will unravel any peace we make with the Palestinians. Okay? That's the... Now, so go back. Okay, wait a second, Hanan, what are you talking about? They don't want us here. You know, 1/4 of the student body at the University of Haifa is Arab. There are all kinds of Israeli Arabs who are, 2/3 of Israel today, 2/3 of Israeli Arabs are actually born in Israel. 2/3 of Israeli Arabs are educated in Israeli schools. 2/3 of Arabs speak Hebrew. Arab elites in Israel are not considered Palestinian by the Palestinians themselves. Go to Ramallah, go to East Jerusalem, talk to the Palestinians about Israeli Arabs, and you'll find out very quickly that the Palestinians themselves do not regard Israeli Arabs as Palestinians. There's a sociologist by the name of Sami Smucha up at the University of Haifa who's done interesting polling, some of which came out only after I published my book. I wish I had it in my book. I've blogged about it. Sami Smucha did a poll recently of Israeli Arabs. 78% of Israeli Arabs say they would prefer to live in Israel than in any Arab state. 45% say they feel closer to Israeli Jews than to Palestinians. The elites of the Israeli Arab community certainly lives in this ambiguous, difficult situation, which, is a kind of foot on the brake and foot on the gas at the same time. They watch Al Jazeera at night. They read Yediot Achronot over lunch. And I have a very good friend, an Israeli playwright by the name of Said Kashua, who writes only in Hebrew. And I asked him, how do you feel about Israel? I interviewed him for my book, but I've also, I love him. We talk all the time. And he said, Bernie, Hebrew is the only language I can talk about sex. Hebrew is the only language I can talk about my father and mother without blushing. Hebrew is the only language in which I can talk about freedom and democracy. He once gave me a wonderful example. He said he once wrote a play in Hebrew, which was then, it was like a radio play, which was then translated into Arabic. And it was played on Arabic radio in Israel. And he said, I listened to my play in Arabic and I got scared. He said, Bernie, I'm a bad boy. I'm a bad boy. I've got a dirty mouth. Listening to his Israeli play in Arabic made him a kind of complete outlier in Arab culture. And the vast majority of young Arabs living in Israel have excellent Hebrew, see themselves as having a kind of hybridized cultural identity. So why would the Arab population not want Israel here? What did Hanan mean by this? And the penny finally dropped for me, the second penny. The quarter dropped for me. When I realized what Hanan was really saying is the following. The Jewish state that we have here is a particular kind of Jewish state. Obviously, the kind of Jewish state that the Arabs would agree to become part of is something which, for want of a better term, I call the Hebrew Republic. That kind of Jewish state the Arabs are willing to live with. They think of, and other polls have shown, that the Israeli Arabs consider what makes the Jewish state distinctive to be mainly the Hebrew language. And that kind of Jewish state they are prepared to live in. So Israel is this Hebrew-speaking civil society, this Hebrew-speaking democratic country in which Arabs have full rights, protection of law, freedom of speech, the right to vote, all the things that you would expect from a Hebrew-speaking republic. And that kind of state, Jewish state, is a state that not only Arabs are prepared to accept, but actually for the elites is very exciting because it's their bridge to the same kind of globalization that Israeli intellectuals and scientists and professionals enjoy. But there's another Jewish state that they have to deal with. And it's the one Hanan had in the back of his mind and couldn't exactly define, but he knows it's there. First of all, there's a Jewish state which is the residue of the Zionist settler, heroic, revolutionary state of the 1940s. The state within a state that, for example, owns 90% of the land of Israel. A lot of people don't pay any attention to this, but Israel's land is 90% owned by the state. About a fifth of Israeli land holdings is the old land of the Jewish National Fund, which until a Supreme Court decision very recently had regulations on the books that the land could never be sold to anybody but a Jew. And by the way, this is the land upon which something like 50% of Israelis live, because it's the land that was originally part of most of the settlement here. I mean, when you look at all the Israeli land holdings, it also includes the Negev, which is, almost not populated at all. So something like 50% of Israeli Jews live on land which until very recently is owned by not only the state but administered by the state for the Jewish National Fund, which had a regulation that that land could not be alienated to anyone but a Jew. This was changed by the Supreme Court, but it's a little, it's a new thing that has not really percolated into the political culture yet. The person who sued the Supreme Court to be allowed to live in this little town called Katsir, his name is Ka'adan, lived in Bakr al-Karbiya. He was a nurse. He was a nurse working in a hospital, completely fluent in Hebrew. He lived in Bakr al-Karbiya and wanted to live in Katsir. Katsir was an old Jewish National Fund town. They would not allow him to buy a house or land there and claim that it was a Jewish National Fund regulation that made it impossible. The Supreme Court, under something called the Law of Human Dignity, regarded that as being undemocratic and overturned it. But it's a little like Brown versus the Board of Education. No one was willing to really implement this. The government was not prepared to actually implement it the way Eisenhower sent in troops to Arkansas and Little Rock. Remember, I mean, in order to have the civil rights movement here, you needed more than a Supreme Court decision. You needed a government that was actually willing to implement it. And the same nurse, Ka'adan, still doesn't live in Katsir. This is a 5-year-old law now, but he still doesn't live in Katsir. So you have 90% of the land of the country held as trust for the Jewish people according to the law that created the Israel Lands Authority in 1960. The basic law of the country is that the Israel Lands Administration administers the land as custodian of the Jewish people. And that's why in Israel, although the Arabs are something between 1/5 and 1/4 of the population, they live on something like 5% of the land. And this is a largely agricultural community still. 5% of the land, 1/5 of the population. That's not an accident. So that's one kind of Jewish state that Arabs are coming up against. Another kind of Jewish state, a state which funds religious education and privileges Orthodox Jewish schools such that today something like 200,000 ultra-Orthodox students are being educated in a school system funded by the government. You have a tremendous sort of ward of the state mentality in the ultra-Orthodox community. And by the way, labor rates, the participation of Israelis in the labor force, of Israeli Jews in the labor force, is something like 57%, 56 to 57%. Only 56, 57% of Israeli Jewish citizens participate in the labor force. In Japan, it's closer to 70%. So the gap between Israeli rates of participation in the labor force and Japanese is largely the Orthodox Jewish community that is really being funded by, the people who live here and are building the businesses that are, working global markets. Another kind of Jewish state, aside from the land and aside from the educational system, a state in which rabbis control divorce, marriage, burial. Let me not go into the long, tortured history of why the so-called religious status quo in Israel exists. I deal with it in my first book, and you can go to Wikipedia and probably find plenty of little essays about why Israel doesn't have a constitution and so on, and why that separation of religion and state in Israel never happened. But if you're an Arab in Israel, you can't marry a Jew. You have no legal way of marrying a Jew in Israel. Imagine. If you want to marry a non-Jew, if you're a Jew and want to marry a non-Jew in Israel, you have to go to Cyprus. Then come back, your marriage will be recognized. So when Hanan says to me, wow, they don't want a Jewish state here, I have to come back to him and say, exactly what kind of Jewish state don't they want? Land, education, rabbinic orthodoxy, and, by the way, there's also other things that the Jewish state is claiming. For example, exclusive sovereignty over Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount and holy places for the Arab population. Now, when you have these kinds of ways of defining the Jewish state, are you not in a situation where you've defined the state such that any dignified person would reject it? I'm not now talking about the Hebrew Republic now. That part they embrace. I'm not saying they embrace it without a sense of being tortured about it. There's always ethnic tensions. There's always a certain amount of torture people feel when they move and assimilate from one culture into another. There were plenty of Jews who came to Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, and in appropriating German culture felt that they were giving up Yiddishkeit. And it was very difficult and painful to do. Just like Jews came to New York and had to write the foreword and write the Yiddish newspapers about all the problems they're having with their kids who don't want to go to synagogue and don't want this. And assimilation is a very painful, tortured process. But the vast majority of Israeli Arabs have said that if Israel as a Jewish state is defined as something like a Hebrew-speaking republic in which they can find a kind of secular space to embrace and adopt Hebrew culture and be part of a Hebrew culture which gives them jobs at Intel and Texas Instruments and positions at the Hadassah Hospital and so on and so forth, they are eager to be there. The kind of Jewish state they're rejecting is one that says you're a second-class citizen. Oh, there's another aspect of the Jewish state called the law of return. Very important. I sometimes don't remember to speak about it because it seems so anachronistic that it's almost kind of a trivial point, but it's really not. Any Jew from Teaneck or from Côte Saint-Luc in Montreal or Downsview in Toronto or Highland Park in Chicago gets on a plane, lands in Israel, becomes a citizen immediately. Any Jew has the right to citizenship merely in virtue of the fact that they are born of a Jewish mother. In fact, anybody who can prove that they have one Jewish grandparent has the right to Israeli citizenship, according to the law of return. Does anybody know why one Jewish grandparent? Because that's how the Germans define the Jews. That's how the Nuremberg laws of 36 define Jewish for purposes of persecuting Jews. So in 1948, it made perfect sense when the State of Israel was being constituted to provide a place for anybody Hitler would have hunted to hide. Right? Makes perfect sense in 1948. It makes zero sense in 2008 when you have a population that's 1/4 or 1/5 Arab and which watches the whole notion of Israelness, of identity in their own country, of national identity being debased to the point where somebody who comes and says they have blood J positive get citizenship. It's a kind of outrage against anybody who has a sense of national life. Is being part of this Hebrew-speaking culture, is that something that you can learn and acquire and be included into, or is it something that you're excluded from immediately because you don't have the right religion or the right mother? if you're an Arab, it's not that people are immediately disadvantaged by this, although many are. There are material privileges that you lose if you don't qualify to be Jewish. I've talked about particularly landholding and residency and so forth. But it's the educative value, the educative impact of this. If you, as I don't know how many Jews are in this audience, but if you were told that in order for you to live in this country, in the United States of America, you would have to be, go through a process of naturalization. But somebody who was Christian is immediately a citizen, it would piss you off. You would not consider yourself to be a full citizen of your own country. The whole notion of national identity becomes perverse. So, I'm going on maybe too long about this, but it's important that you understand this, that Israel really has two states. When you talk about a Jewish state, Israel is really two Jewish states. It's two Jewish states. It's a Hebrew republic, it's a Hebrew democratic civil society, but encasing this other state, this state of residual Zionist institutions, rabbinic privilege, legal obstacles, which make it impossible for Arabs to consider themselves full citizens of the country in which they live. And then when Hanan comes back to me and says, listen, you don't understand, they don't want us here, I had to write a book to say, wait a second, what Jewish state don't they want here? And by the way, I don't want that Jewish state here. I'm a Democrat. There's nothing particularly original in my book. Honestly, the whole process of writing this book sort of revealed to myself that the only thing I really care about is bringing Israel up to code. I don't want to be a light unto the nations. I just want to bring Israel up to code. There is something called the European Union. The European Union has a Charter of Human Rights. There's something called the United States of America. The United States of America has a Bill of Rights. There's something called Canada, and Canada also has two nations, and it has Articles of Confederation, and most recently under Trudeau has a Bill of Rights. All I want for Israel is something that's been done in every other democratic country everywhere, and which works. Who would have thought, 1948, the European Union would be what it is? It's the single most important achievement of my lifetime. Who would have thought back in 1948 that Germany and Poland and all these countries would somehow find institutional processes which would allow them to settle their problems non-violently, and that ultimately after World War II, you'd have a borderless Europe with a single currency, by the way, whose value is largely dictated by German banks. Who would have thought it? But you put certain healthy processes together, and eventually you get something new. You don't understand, Bernie. They don't want us here. You don't understand Hanan. I mean, I love him. I feel guilty saying this without him being here to defend himself. But, Hanan, you don't understand that the thing they don't want is a Jewish state that's so ill-defined. A Jewish state that has so many aspects to it that are anachronistic. A Jewish state that has legal impediments to people regarding themselves as being full citizens. That Jewish state, if you were in their shoes, you would reject. You wouldn't want it here. And that's the purpose of thinking about the peace process as something more than just some technical things that are, done by diplomats behind closed doors. Because the peace process, what is democracy if not a peace process? Democracy is a peace process. Democracy is a peace process that never ends. Democracy is an approach to conflict resolution. It starts from the assumption that we have certain rights, and these rights are equally bestowed, and that you're bound to have conflicts, you're bound to have religious differences, not just between Arabs and Jews, but between Arabs and Jews, and that the only way to resolve such conflicts peacefully is to ascribe to Arabs and Jews a realm of voluntary association where they can have any religious community and any religious congregation that they want, but that they not have a state that imposes this kind of thing on your consciousness, and that every individual has the right and the protections to pursue these things for themselves. That's how you mitigate conflict. You don't mitigate conflict by, putting this perfect jigsaw puzzle together. You mitigate conflict by creating democratic processes so the inevitable conflicts of human nature can be resolved peacefully. It's a peace process. And the thing that I'm most concerned about is that what we're not acknowledging in Israel is that the two-state solution is not really the only peace process that we have to pursue. Because as long as you have only that peace process, you're not acknowledging the other conflict that's simmering beneath the surface, that's getting in the way of allowing people to feel that they're actually moving toward a way of life which is going to be successful. One final word about this. I don't think, for all kinds of reasons, I don't think that the Israeli reality is a reality that's going to easily get unstuck. I think we have to stop talking about the peace process. In this sense, my dinner conversation partners have persuaded me. We have to stop talking about the peace process as just some diplomatic thing that happens. We have to talk about the peace process as an overarching approach to conflict resolution, which includes things like reforming Israel's legal structures, which includes thinking about the development of federal arrangements between Israel and neighbors who have to share certain jurisdictions just to exist. If you look at Israel and Palestine today, you're basically looking at one economy. There's no jurisdiction that Israel can exercise over water rights, over telecommunications policy and bandwidth, over labor migration, over any number of things, including currency, the existence of a currency for the purposes of commerce. There's no jurisdiction Israel can exercise which does not include Palestinians. Talking about two hermetically sealed states is absurd. In fact, when people talk to me, are you in favor of a two-state solution? I say, no, I'm actually in favor of a three-state solution and a 20-state solution. Because I think ultimately you're going to have an economic union between Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, and no Palestinian I know who talks about the future doesn't say this to me. And I've never talked to a Palestinian who says that he doesn't want the Israeli shekel as the currency of the country. Because 90% of their exports already go to Israel. So a three-state solution and a 20-state solution, I think we have to start talking about the integration of this economic entity into a Mediterranean union, such as the one Sarkozy has talked about, and start learning from the Europeans about how to put together federal arrangements that relaxes the kinds of tensions and allows for the kind of global consciousness and global realities that actually allowed Israel to prosper in the first place. So, we have to think about reforming the system. We have to talk about expanding our consciousness and thinking about peace in a much more spacious and visionary way, and realize that the kinds of conflicts we have between Hanan and his neighbors are not going to go away, but they have to be trumped and transcended by a different way of talking about the future. A vision which is a vision of democratic processes mitigating conflict and federal arrangements allowing for the kinds of expansion of commerce, but also expansion of consciousness that is going to be fundamental to allowing people to get unstuck. And now I'll take your questions. Yes?
Great talk, by the way. It seems to me that North American Jews, I'm saying this as a Canadian American, don't really care that much about the inner workings of Israel. That's a country that needs to take care of its own things. I was struck by an article by Stanley Fish about identity politics, that it seems that all North American Jews really care about. We may disagree totally about Israel and how it's run and the Orthodox or secular. We just want it to survive. And it seems to me the reason we want it to survive is, in Stanley Fish's words, if things go south for Jews here, we've got a place to go to. Could you comment on that?
Look, Stanley Fish would have a real problem living in Israel because he'll never get tenure at the Hebrew University.
University's not even going to open.
You know, that's true. There may be a problem. I don't even want to think about that. But there's, you know, they said that God could never get tenure at the Hebrew University because he only publishes in Hebrew. I think, you know, with all due respect to Stanley Fish, look, I don't want to speak about what he may have said or may not have said in his absence. I think American Jews have a kind of peculiar idea about Israel. On the one hand, you know, there's a kind of natural impulse to think about Israel as sort of the refuge from physical danger. And yet, on the other hand, everybody knows that the only place on earth today that Jews are really in physical danger is Israel. And so on the one hand, it's like, you know, we have to you know, have a place of refuge. On the other hand, we have to do everything to give them security. You know, it's like there's this kind of doublethink. The vast majority of American Jews, I think, understand that America is a place in which the Jews are, you know, since Portnoy's complaint, we know that the Jews are just like everybody else. And everybody knows that the Jews are just like everybody else. And, you know, the idea that the Jews are in a kind of peculiar, like going south here, the idea of that, you know, that things go south for the Jews in America. If things go south for the Jews in America, America is going south. There's going to be a bigger kind of more global problem than just the question of whether or not we can get on, you know, continental airlines and go land in Tel Aviv. There's going to be a different kind of problem here. On the other hand, I think most Jews actually have a different kind of sentimental attachment to Israel, which is not really about it's not really about the fear of physical danger here. I think it's more like Israel has become, particularly Jerusalem, has become a kind of Jewish Epcot center. You know, I mean, Jews. The way it once occurred to me that, you know, the Jews often think about coming to Jerusalem like, you know, they're coming to a big Jewish convention and they're super delegates. You know, they don't have to do anything except show up. They're honorary citizens. And most American Jews would find Israel an extremely challenging place to live. They don't know the language. They don't know the way to, line up for a bus. They don't know how to start a sentence and find people not letting them get to the end of their sentences. I mean, we have a certain notion of the way to live here, which Israelis do and don't know. I mean, Israel is a kind of peculiar place, but the most important thing that American Jews don't have in Israel is the capacity to appreciate Yehuda Amichai's poetry. I mean, imagine you consider yourself somebody who ought to be an American. You're an American, except you don't speak English and you never heard of Bruce Springsteen. I mean, it's ridiculous. I'm not saying American Jews can't go to Israel and love it. I did. It's really something to love. I love it dearly. I love Israeli culture. I love Hebrew culture. I loved it since I was this high and I read the book of Genesis, and there was in my English classes in parochial school in Montreal, I would read Dick Jane, See Spot Run, Oh Dear, Oh Jill, Oh This, Oh That. In Hebrew, I was reading, Cain is killing Abel, and Joseph is jealous, and Levi and Shimon are jealous of Joseph, and they throw him in the pit, and he wants to sleep with her, and she wants to kill him. And I thought, that's my family. I mean, that's real life. I was only 2 years old, but I had this sense of, wow, that's kind of interesting. Not 2 years old, I was old in the second grade. I thought that was kind of interesting. So I'm not saying that there aren't things in Hebrew culture to love. There's a lot in Hebrew culture to love, and one of the reasons why Zionism, I think, has been a great success is because it created a kind of climate in which individuals can sort of figure out their modernist imaginations within a Hebrew context. That's why it's so appealing to me. But for most American Jews, it's a closed book. You go to Israel on the Sukkot holiday, and you take a lulav and shake it in Jerusalem, and you think it's more meaningful somehow that you're doing it in Jerusalem, next to Herod's, Herod's wall. Why? It's kind of weird, really, when you think about it. It's like belonging to a cult. Most American Jews have a very peculiar relationship to Israel. And the kind of Israel that they find easiest to relate to is an Israel under siege, because that gives them a chance to kind of rehearse what I basically did as an 18-year-old in Montreal, rehearse this idea that, if the Nazis were ever coming here, boy, I would know what to do, or I'm going to stand up to them in some way. I mean, there's a kind of romantic idea that we can never let this genocide happen again. And because we can never let this genocide happen again, we have to have this kind of vicarious, this sense of vicarious, making a stand, this vicarious ghetto revolt against Jew hatred. And so in some sense, we feel comfortable with an Israel in that state of siege, because it helps us sort of work off our sense of passion and anger and grief about what happened in World War II. On the other hand, we like an Israel that looks sort of like our shul. We like an Israel with Jewish law, with Jewish holidays, with a kind of liturgical music, because it looks like, even though we don't understand the liturgy, right? We have to read it in translation, but we like the idea that Israel is a place that kind of feels like a big Jewish congregation. So when we say Jewish state, it's sort of like a synagogue with laws, a synagogue with an army, And that's not sustainable. That kind of relationship is not sustainable, because the Israelis who actually live in that country actually have a very sophisticated, subtle, and wonderful culture of their own. And Israelis and American Jews largely don't penetrate it. So it's not the basis for a relationship that in order for you to be something that I can love, I think, well, who is it, John Donne, who said, stand still and no, hold your tongue so that I can love you. I remember, don't speak so I can love you. It's like Israel has to be a country that's mute so it can accept all the projections of American Jews. It's not a sustainable basis for a relationship. The honeymoon ends very quickly. Jack.
Yes, this is interesting. I wanted to look at it from the other side of it. Up until rather recently, I've always thought that if in Israel they ever make the changes that will make it into a state for Jews rather than a Jewish state,
Yeah.
that would be wonderful. And that meant that a major change had to occur within the Israeli society, within their own notional conception of it. And even when Hamas won, I thought, hey, that's a great opportunity. You finally have the most fanatic people, and they're going to be apprivoisés, how do you say, they're going to be tamed. But in the past 5, 10 years or so, the whole notion of Dar al-Islam as a unit that cannot be at all violated as it has been done in the past is now a major thing. Not the Arab states, but Muslim, many of them intellectuals.
Right.
And I'm wondering whether at this stage of the game, even the most major changes in Israel will permit it to be regarded as really belonging in that area.
Look, Jack, it's a question no one can really answer. And I don't doubt that reasonable people can paint a scenario in which Islamic, pan-Islamic, Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, the sort of super state, the idea of a kind of super caliphate.
Actually, that's not what Dar al-Islam is about. Dar al-Islam really is the notion that within a certain area, already Islam has established itself. There is no acceptance of any other form of political or even religious power.
No, I'm conceding that there are people, certainly in Hamas, there are people who think this way. And I have no way of knowing, none of us have any way of knowing, whether this attitude will ultimately triumph. But what is interesting to me is that it's almost self-evident that people who do believe this way have been feeding off a condition of conflict and violence for the last 25 years. I lived in Israel, I lived in Jerusalem in the early 1970s. We were talking about this. You could go anywhere in the West Bank, sit and talk to people. You never saw people wearing the veil. The first person to warn me about the rise of what we now call fundamentalist or jihadist forces was the Minister of Information in Jordan in 1983, who said, if this thing goes on, would you look at these kids who are sitting in exploding trucks, blowing themselves up in trucks? She wasn't talking about Al-Qaeda. She wasn't talking about people in the West Bank. She was talking about Iranian kids blowing themselves up in the war with Iraq. And it's just self-evident to me that this kind of mentality, this sort of ecstatic, sacrificial, violent approach to politics, feeds off a condition of frustration, poverty, violence. People have a terrible thing about them. Human beings have a terrible thing about them. They want to live a meaningful life. And if they can't live a meaningful life, maybe they can have a meaningful death. But people want to be meaningful. And it's frightening, it's frustrating. I don't know if Islamist ideas and jihadist ideas can really be made to dissipate over a period of time, but I have a stake in trying to make that happen. Because if they can't be, the idea that by maintaining the status quo, we're somehow holding out in our best way against it is nonsense. Because if Israel thinks that the status quo serves its purpose in trying to prevent jihadism, it's completely crazy. Because what it's leading to is Bosnia. Where we're going now is Bosnia. The status quo cannot be sustained. And the people who are actually making the country rich are going to go to Santa Clara. It's already happening. And what's going to be left is a kind of little Jewish Pakistan trying to hold out in a Bosnian war of ethnic cleansing on both sides. That's not a prospect that's going to ultimately lead to the consolidation of a, quote, Jewish state, unquote. So you have to begin to think, even if you're right, that we're looking at forces that are very, very hard to control and these genies are out of the bottle and so on. Yes, but the only possible way to mitigate them is to mitigate them the same way that people the world over have mitigated sacrificial, ecstatic, religious violence, and that's through the development of civil societies. Yes?
Two questions. One is regarding the externalization of the Jewish religion in Israel.
The what?
The externalization
Yeah.
of Jewish religion, which also the number of the population that is religious, as you presented it, is about a quarter of the students in the first grade, and about, I don't know what the percentage in the population, 20% maybe, multiplying a lot more than the secular or
Right.
less extreme,
Right,
and gaining more and more political power.
right.
Of course, from their perspective, the notion of this republic is totally unacceptable.
Correct.
That's one issue. How do you bridge over that?
Yeah.
The second issue is what's happening on the West Bank. What is totally different now from what it was when Barak and the Arafat were negotiating. The settlements are now spread out all over the West Bank. There is hardly any piece of land that you could separate
Right.
and say this is where the Palestinian state is going to be. Considering also how hostile the settlers are to the Israeli government, how do you create a second state even if we were going to do it?
Okay, so let me try to connect the two dots because your questions are actually complementary. I think one of the things that's kind of interesting about the ultra-Orthodox population in Israel is its geographic concentration. If you actually look at Israel as a whole, as I say, something like 1/4 of first graders are in either ultra-Orthodox school or national Orthodox school with no separation of religion and state, right? But if you look in this area here around Jerusalem and the settlements created out of Jerusalem, it's more like 60%. First graders in Jerusalem, 45% ultra-Orthodox, 15% National Orthodox, 30% Arab, and 10% me. That's Jerusalem today. About 10% of the Jewish population of Jerusalem is what we think of as secular, like the kind of thing you find on the coastal plain in Tel Aviv. Something like 180,000 Jews have left Jerusalem for Tel Aviv in the last 15 years. And most of them are secular, and many of them are the kids of secular families that they've left behind here, and they come up for Sabbath meals and then they go back. Okay? So, something like 60% of the city of Jerusalem is ultra-Orthodox of one kind or another, and connected to the settlements who are also almost entirely National Orthodox. And 30% are Arab. Okay, so if you think about what this is in the Jewish population, it's like 80%, right? The way I like to think about this, I don't like to think of it, breaks my heart to think about it this way, but I think it's true, is to think about this area as a kind of state of Judea. It's like the state within a state. It's a state within a state. These people live not only in the privileges that I've described, the privileges that make Arabs feel alien, but they valorize these privileges, they celebrate these privileges, and they live within this community, which, you know, Arthur Koestler had this wonderful phrase. He talked about Jewish claustrophilia. You know, it's sort of Jewish claustrophilia, the state of Judea. And many of them actually call themselves residents of the state of Judea. They use the term because they don't like the term Israel, because they don't like Israeliness. They think Israeliness threatens them because they know Israeliness is a kind of secular Hebrew version of Jewish life that feels too inclusive and too dangerous. The question that we can't somehow forget, and I'm not sure there's an answer to, but the real question is, about 2/3 of Israel is Israeli. About 1/3 of Israel is Judean, and sort of concentrated around here. Are Israelis going to fight Judeans for the sake of Palestinians? If you look at all of the polls, Israeli Jews support the elements of the deal by about 65%. On Jerusalem, it's a little lower because they don't really know what that would look like. But if you look at the Clinton bridging parameters and you kind of break them up into their parts, something like 2/3 of Jews in Israel support them. But when the pollster says, are you prepared to risk national solidarity for the sake of implementing them, the answer is that the poll drops like a stone, 20%, 15%. So you have this really difficult contradiction, which is that these Israelis can make peace with a Palestinian state, but these Judeans cannot, because the Judeans think about the Palestinian state and the influx of refugees from Syria, from Jordan, from Lebanon. They think of the influx of refugees a little like the way the Arabs thought about the influx of Jews in the 40s. Because they know that once the gates are open, this area around Jerusalem is going to become an Arab city, like Tel Aviv is a Jewish city. 2 million Arabs are going to come in. I mean, we talk about solving the refugee problem. Now we have to think about the implications of it. If 2 million refugees come not to the coastal plain, where that would destroy Israel, right? But if 2 million refugees come to the area of Jerusalem, you're going to have like Nashville and a half of an Arab city growing up in East Jerusalem. And that's their natural hub, because all of the towns, Jenin, Nablus, Ramallah, Hebron, Bethlehem, all of these towns are really suburbs of East Jerusalem. And what you're going to have is a kind of megalopolis, an Arab megalopolis, or that's a hub out of East Jerusalem, accommodating, becoming the DNA for the growth of an Arab city, of an Arab city-state. Just like Israel is a city-state. I mean, basically, we have to remember, we're talking about areas no bigger than Los Angeles. You know, we're talking about greater Los Angeles here. So there's going to be an Arab Los Angeles and a Jewish Los Angeles. The Arabs who are coming into this area are going to make life for the Judeans unimaginably different. In a state of peace, just the tourists who come into Jerusalem will make the life of Judeans unimaginably different. Because consider peace and consider how much the Arabs are going to be dependent on tourism to earn foreign exchange. It's going to be their biggest industry in the beginning. You know how many tourists Israel gets? How many tourists Jerusalem gets? Under 2 million. Prague gets 8 million. Munich gets 9 million. You know, tourism is going to change the face of the city. I'm kind of looking forward to it, but, you know, my cousins who live in East Jerusalem, in the Jewish part of the old city, and who are part of the Bnei Akiva movement, and who are part of the, you know, National Religious Party, and who for whom Jerusalem is a kind of anchor for a Jewish state like you know, Iran is a Muslim state. They believe in theocracy. They want a theocracy. That kind of person is deeply threatened by the influx of Arabs. It's not a problem that they're coming to old Israel. It's they're coming to Judea. Yes?
Well, when I talk to Israelis about their anxieties around this question of peace, the other detail that seems to come up, and sometimes I hear Israeli officials speak about this, is this anxiety about the demography problem, that within the borders of Israel, that there's a sense that very soon there will be an Arab majority as citizens of the state of Israel. And that seems to be the thing that's sort of silently terrifying the current Jewish majority.
Look, these are not small issues. You have nervousness about demographic changes in Holland, in France. The thing that I think we have to remember is that, well, first of all, it depends what you mean by demography. If you just create a kind of undifferentiated Arab population, Palestinians, West Bankers, Gazans, Israeli Arabs, add them up all together. They're all Arabs anyway. They're not like us. Therefore, they're more of them. Therefore, how can we be a democracy if there are more of them?
I think there's it may be a phobia kind of, that, the Arabs are, within Israel, but specifically that they seem to be this absolute terror and fear among
Okay,
Israelis
but you
that-
see, here's an interesting question. Why is it then that that there are 10 times more, I'm making this up, but I'm sure it's actually 20 times more, I'm being conservative, 10 times more Arabs learning Hebrew within a 100-mile radius of Tel Aviv than Jews learning Arabic? Why? Why? Because the language of work, huh?
Arabic is harder.
No, seriously. Arabic isn't so hard. I've seen little 4-year-olds speak it. No, really, why? Because the political economic power, the hegemonic political economic power of Tel Aviv attracts. And if you want to succeed at Intel, if you want to succeed at Motorola, if you want a job in IBM Global Services, if you want to get a medical degree that's worth something, you've got to learn Hebrew. If you want to work in a culture that feels like a little Hebrew version of that global thing, which is Hebrew and English mixed up together and so on, you have to learn Hebrew. If you want to be part of what's happening in the film industry in the region, if you want to be part of what's happening in the music industry, if you want to be part of, if you want to be part of this effervescent Hebrew-speaking society. It's what I find so remarkable about all of this, because I don't know what's going to be 40 years, 50. I mean, the projections are, oh my God, You know, right now they're 20%, soon they'll be 25%. My God, in 40 years or 50 years, they'll be 40% of the country. Then what? Who the hell knows what will be 50 years from now? Could you imagine CIA people sitting around in Langley, you know, in 1955, projecting forward to what America will be, you know, 50 years hence? Could you imagine Alan Dulles sitting around and saying, oh my God, there's going to be Google, and we're going to have, you know, a third Hispanic population, and God, you know, WASPs are, by the way, going to be a minority. You know, it's like listening to Pat Buchanan sort of on MSNBC, sort of terrified of, you know, sort of the loss of this thing, this American thing. He wants to go to the parts of America that are American. You know, it's ridiculous. Why can't Jews realize that Hebrew culture can compete? That Hebrew culture is actually pretty damn attractive, and a lot of people will want to assimilate into it. Hebrew culture is a draw. And if 40 years from now, somebody who speaks Hebrew has an Arab origin, but is able to contribute in an interesting, iconoclastic way to the development of Hebrew culture, why do I care what kind of hybridized identity that person has? I don't care. If you know, Israelis also used to be afraid of North African Jews. Real Israelis used to be afraid of North African Jews. My friend Said Kashua, to me, is a wonderful Israeli. I love being with him. I love spending time with him. If my kid and his kid, he has the most beautiful daughter in the world. If my kid, my grandchild and his grandchild wanted to get married, I wouldn't mind. I'd love it for him to be a member of my family. Do I care? But that doesn't mean I don't love the liturgy on Yom Kippur. It doesn't mean I don't love, you know, Yehuda Amichai's poetry or Chava Alberstein's music. Now I'm really dating myself, you know. No, she's so 5 minutes ago, you know. She's so 10 minutes ago. But you know, I love this stuff. So why shouldn't I continue to love it? If he loves it, I feel. Listen, I'll tell you, it's the most moving thing. I know I'm sort of wasting time here, but the most moving thing I ever heard was the American ambassador to Israel, Thomas Pickering, who's a great man, and I hope will be part of the Obama administration. Thomas Pickering comes to, by the way, knocking wood is not a Jewish thing, right? Knocking wood's a Christian thing, but we do it, right? Give you an example. Talk about hybridized identities, right? Thomas Pickering gave a lecture on Thomas Jefferson at Tel Aviv University in Hebrew. And I almost cried. Could you imagine the original Zionists at the turn of the century who were trying to put down the roots of a Hebrew-speaking civilization, imagining an American ambassador to a Hebrew-speaking country giving a talk on Thomas Jefferson in the Hebrew language? I felt so privileged to have lived to see it. If Arabs in my country want to learn Hebrew and honor me by learning my poetry, I would not want that. It gives me goosebumps to feel the honor of that. So what am I afraid of? If I felt that somehow my culture and the political economy subtending my culture was not strong enough to withstand that kind of, you know, assimilation, and that it would all be, you know, it would all be overrun and overcome, I would feel concerned about it the same way Quebecers felt concerned and felt they had to take certain defensive positions vis-a-vis the loss of French Canada on the North American continent. And they often looked to the Zionists, by the way. René Lévesque, during the Quiet Revolution, when I grew up, was growing up in Montreal, would often invoke the tradition of Zionists to do the things that French Canadians needed to do to protect French culture. Teach it in the schools, make it the official language, make it the language of work, and so on. I completely believe in that and think that the Israelis have every right to create those kinds of defenses for Hebrew culture. But if people are prepared to assimilate into it, I have to predict whether 40 years from now, 50 years from now, somebody had a Jewish grandmother, an Arab grandmother, or a Kurdish grandmother, or a, you know, it just feels to me a kind of outrage against the most basic things I believe and that I've seen work again and again across Europe and in this country and in Canada. Yeah, you had it. Sorry, you had it.
Just a comment, and I was wondering, were you surprised at what happened in Akko recently?
No.
Because that rule.
I was not surprised. It was heartbreaking because Akko is one of the most open, interesting, hybridized within the Jewish world, it's sort of the most cosmopolitan little place. And Akko has had this wonderful festival year in, year out of a kind of fringe theater of Arabs and Jews together doing stage and experimental film and music together. And the Akko Festival has been just the most beautiful tribute to what Israel can be year in, year out.
What happened
Huh?
before Yom Kippur? Maybe you can tell everyone.
Well, there was this apparent case of an Arab driver driving into a Jewish neighborhood in Akko over the Yom Kippur holiday. And for whatever reason, I don't know exactly what happened, the Jews of the neighborhood thought that this was a deliberate provocation and beat him up. And it created this kind of, you know, the way American cities exploded in the 1960s over racial, misunderstandings that became violent. And it was just a tragedy. But if you ask me, am I surprised? Absolutely not surprised. Because ultimately, if Israel does not solve this problem, I said before that 45% of Israeli Arabs feel closer to Jews. That's where the jihadists will come from. It's in the 45% that feel close to the Jews, not in the 55% who feel kind of more distant or indifferent. It's the ones who feel that they are being invited in on the one hand and being shown the door on the other. And, I think, look, there are a lot of Arab towns, I go into it in the book, but there are a lot of Arab towns that don't have the kind of elementary services. They're being turned into these kind of townships outside of the greater Tel Aviv. Some of them are being controlled by drug gangs and youth gangs, and the unemployment is 40% in some cases. You're going to have South Central LA there. It's going to be a different kind of intifada than the one you had in the West Bank, but you're going to have a huge intifada. When I talk about a Bosnia situation, that's what we're going to get. So, no, I'm not surprised. I'm heartbroken because I was hoping that we could keep the lid on this for the next 10 years and try to get to some kind of diplomatic progress to kind of mitigate the worst features of this. But it's very, very dangerous. And it's not going to, the status quo is simply unsustainable. Yes?
I guess this kind of runs off of the first question I asked about North American Jews. I actually went to Israel for the first time, and a lot of what you talked about tonight has kind of hit me because I felt this kind of internal struggle with the fact that I had Israel on the one hand, like this great place to be a Jew and feel totally comfortable, and then I went there, and especially with the religious Jews, did not feel totally comfortable. With that said, though, I feel like a lot of what you're talking about would be great, but I don't know why a law of return wouldn't be allowed to still be in place, because I understand you could create some kind of other way for an Arab to become a citizen, but at the same time, I feel like the history of Israel is so ingrained also in what happened in World War II that I don't see why that couldn't be part of a more democratic.
All right, let me qualify it. If you're a refugee from anti-Semitism, you can get a preference for resident alien status in this country. In this country. I see absolutely no reason why Israel can't have on the books that anybody who considers themselves anywhere in the world a refugee from anti-Semitism, or even somebody who simply sees his fate cast with the Jewish people, that such a person can be considered for resident alien status. And I'd take it one more step. If you are of the Jewish religion and therefore see yourself as a Jewish national, is this going to be messy? Yes. But resident alien status is very different from citizenship. If you want an immigration law in Israel that says that people who are ethnic Jews, I mean, there are such laws for Bulgaria has such laws, Greece has such laws, England has such laws, Germany has such laws. There are nation states in the world that have laws on the books that give preference to people who are, as it were, returning nationals. If Israel had such laws that said, we are going to be a refuge for Jews worldwide, and if you are a refugee from anti-Semitism, you have a place here, I'm all for it. But the law of return says something else. The law of return doesn't say you have resident alien status or that you have the right to earn citizenship. It says you are a citizen. And what it does is it debases the very idea of national identity. Instead of saying that national identity is something you acquire through the acquisition of language and a familiarity with the culture and a familiarity with the geography and everything else that you acquire when you move to a new country, instead of saying that citizenship is something you earn over a period of time, as you do in this country. I mean, I'm Canadian. I had to go through a process of naturalization here before I became a citizen. If you don't have that process of naturalization, it's as if you're saying that your national identity is not something that can be acquired. It's something that you are bestowed in virtue of your religion or your accident of birth. And that is what I regard as being fundamentally undemocratic. You need to create a national identity which is spacious enough to be inclusive of anybody who undertakes to learn it, to acquire it, to practice it, and to, you know, do you see my point?
Yeah, I see your argument, but I guess I'm not trying to be like a smart aleck or anything.
No, go ahead.
I'm just saying, I'm thinking about my own family. How do you say to a Holocaust survivor that they see the state of Israel as part of that history, that they couldn't become a citizen?
They can become a citizen. They just can't become a citizen the moment they touch down.
The language is
They can be,
absorbed.
huh?
You are absorbed in Israel, you know, it's the absorption agency. You just.
No, but but I'm not, so do it in 3 years, do it in 4 years. I'm not saying that you can't acquire citizenship, but you want to define the acquisition, you want to define the process of acquiring citizenship to be something that goes hand in hand with the acquisition of a national identity. And you want to define national identity in a way that doesn't debase or make nonsense of the national identity of your minorities in the country who may not be Jews, but actually have acquired that identity.
Why is that an important issue, Bernard? I mean, we're not talking about zillions of people anymore coming into that country.
Because it's important, because it's a tremendous symbolic issue, because for the Arabs, because the Arabs of Israel want to believe that the only identity that the state of Israel can bestow is Israeli.
There's so much more that one can do for the Arab Israelis that Mickey Mouse doesn't like it, to be honest.
No, I really disagree with you, Jack. I think that the Arabs of Israel regard the law of return as a fundamental insult to the idea that Israeli identity is as much theirs as anybody else's, that Israel is a state of its citizens. it's not a state of the world Jewish people. It may have its origins in the Jewish people, but the state of Israel has a requirement to be a state of its own citizens. And it's important that citizenship be understood as something that is earned and goes in hand with the acquisition of a national identity that is not exclusive. It's a very important symbolic issue. And there are other symbolic issues, a flag, the national anthem, all these things. Look, I lived in Canada through the flag debate. I don't know how many of you remember that the flag of Canada used to be a Union Jack in the corner and something called the red ensign. You know? And it was basically a statement that Canada is nothing but a kind of, stepchild of England. Well, for the French community of Canada, this was an offense. It was an affront. And we had to come up with a new flag. I'm not saying you have to come up with a new Israeli flag. You can fly the flag of Israel and the flag of the European Union together in Israel, or the flag of Israel and the flag of the common market of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan together. And maybe that would mitigate a lot of the hard feelings. You can add a new verse to Hatikvah, or you can sing Hatikvah as the anthem of the historic Zionist movement and create a new national anthem for the country. These are not such big things. These are not such terrible things. Other countries have gone through this. And I'm no less, passionate about the justice to the historic Jewish people as other people are. But you've got to start to create a newness which allows people to feel that this is theirs too, and that they are equal to everybody else. Otherwise, they're going to not like it. And when people feel that they don't like it, they become violent. I mean, this kind of, we can't mitigate this violence without thinking about how to extend genuine, somebody, I guess Spinoza, we was at lunch today with your friend.
Your one quote from
Well, my one quote from Spinoza, that peace is not the absence of violence, but the presence of justice. That's what we've got to think about. We've got to think about, really, what's justice? What is true for me that can also be true for you? If it's fair for me, it's got to be fair for you. It's a kind of basic ethical principle. I'm not asking anything of myself that I wouldn't ask of you, and vice versa. I'm not asking of you anything I wouldn't ask of myself. If you can't ask that question and can't live that way, you're not only not going to make a very successful country, you're not going to make a very successful marriage. It's like a very fundamental fact of human ethical life.
Well, the bell is tolling.
It tolls also for me.
For those of you who are interested, as long as Bernie has energy, we can continue this conversation in a more informal way.
For those of you who are interested, Amazon.com.
Yes, unfortunately, we didn't bring any
26 bucks.
Is it even
Everything
that
you
much
ever
on
wanted.
Amazon? I think it's
Actually,
less.
it's less. It's about $15 on Amazon.